For more, let's cross to Chicago. Daniel Lansberg-Rodriguez teaches at Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management. Thank you for speaking with us here on France 24.
Thank you for having me on the show, Francois. It's always a pleasure.
You're just back from the border between Venezuela and Colombia there. And what are your thoughts when you see Marco Rubio there? Does he help or hurt the cause of Juan Guaido?
Well, I think it's important that people actually go to the border and see what's going on. It's very difficult for people outside of the immediate confines of the problem and the humanitarian tragedy that's currently underway in Venezuela to get their heads fully wrapped around the degree of human suffering that's actually going on. Venezuela spent many years as a bit of a punchline with its bufa type leaderships, it's comedia bufa type leaders, crazy quotes, funny policies. And at some point, Venezuela sort of transitioned from joke to a tragedy of Shakespearean levels. And I think that the world has been a little bit slower to react. So in as much as getting anybody who is connected to the power structures in the external community to come to Cucuta and see the extent to which Colombia is struggling. It's not a wealthy country, and it has 1.3 million Venezuelans flooding over its borders. I think that the attention being paid is important, although it obviously can complicate things a little bit given the internal dynamics within Chavismo.
Yeah, I was going to say, having a hawkish Republican senator be the one there at the border, doesn't that fuel the narrative put forth by Nicolas Maduro that it's a U.S.-led slow coup?
It does. That said, the old days in which Maduro could utilize his grand narrative that he inherited from Chavez to attempt to curry support outside of his very immediate base are really long over. The living standards in Venezuela have plunged so low that there's really not that much of a dynamic in which anything really that happens outside is going to help Maduro's popularity. The dynamics that are important actually have to do with the dynamics within Chavismo itself, because right now there are factions of the leading party that are souring on Maduro. There's military factions whose loyalty to to Maduro and to the revolution is potentially wavering. Those are the dynamics that probably matter most in terms of this transition at this point. So, in as much as it creates uncertainty having a hawkish Republican come visit the border in Cucuta, given that there's a widespread understanding that Cucuta is going to be the next flashpoint, it can actually, I think, create or exacerbate existing uncertainties within the groups that are ultimately going to have to turn on Maduro if a transition is going to take place.
We see kind of a holding pattern when it comes to domestic politics, but on the international front, there is a bit of wavering. First of all, those 5 MEPs, when they ask that the EU stop all contact with Nicolas Maduro, do you think that's a good idea?
It's a very risky idea. Right now, generally speaking, governments don't shut down all contact with the people who are in charge, or at least actively in charge of a country, because that opens you up to certain risks. By and large, since really the 1970s thereabouts, you don't recognize a government in exile or a government who has no real power, regardless of how much you may dislike the people who actually have their hands on the reins. If Maduro doesn't fall quickly, the risk is that a crisis will emerge. For example, let's say a plane is not allowed to take off, or a European airline has a plane that gets grounded in Caracas airport. The European Union needs to have someone to call. And if you've broken off contact, that's something that complicates it. Or if 2 Canadians or an American are stopped and arrested on trumped-up charges of espionage, it's difficult if Mike Pompeo's options are essentially just to call Guaido. Or Guaido's government. So if it's something that can create and exacerbate existing tensions and weaken Maduro in the short term, but if transition is not brought about quickly, it actually becomes much more complicated, because at that point, for any crisis, you have to go through a third party. So call up Mexico and ask López Obrador to pass a note, and those sorts of dynamics tend to raise the costs of getting anything done by adding extra intermediaries.
Now, at the outset of this crisis coming to a head, it was billed as a Cold War-style left versus right proxy battle with the Russians and the Chinese on one side, in the West on the other. However, we have, for instance, the Wall Street Journal reporting that Guaido has reached out to China. The Financial Times now reporting that there are back-channel talks going on between Juan Guaido and Russia. How's it going on that score?
So those are really the two main partners that the Maduro government still has at this stage of the game. China has been souring on Maduro for some time. Essentially, every time a new leader or a new group of leaders has risen to the forefront of the opposition since probably the 2015 elections, you have had a conversation or a series of conversations with China. It's difficult for China to commit, however, to revoking their support of Maduro for various reasons. One is the uncertainty of not knowing who exactly among the opposition would ultimately be in charge when the smoke clears. Another issue is the fact that they're worried, given what happened in Libya when China was the last country to pull away their support of Gaddafi. And afterwards, they were sort of frozen out of some of the contracts. They had to evacuate their people very expensively on very short notice. And those sorts of lessons have made them a little bit, I think, more cautious even than they were before about formally changing their support. Russia is a little bit less monolithic in that sense. You have some very specific geopolitical reasons why Putin may favor having a more chaotic situation in Venezuela. It's in the backyard of his main geopolitical rival. Venezuela has really become a bit of a launching pad for Russia in the region, and that's a region that it has not been particularly strong in for 30, 40 years. That said, the strongest connections are actually not necessarily the geopolitical ones with Putin, but rather some specific connections between certain oligarchs in Putin's orbit. Like Mr. Sechin, the CEO of Rosneft, who has a very close relationship with the Venezuelan government and a lot of investments there. Gazprom, which has the same pressure ostensibly from the Kremlin, but less of a personal connection, we've seen the extent to which they have been a little bit more cautious in the relationship, making sure that they do not open themselves up to potential sanctions, sort of timing things out, pacing things very steadily. Whereas, and Putin, his relationship with the oligarchs has, in the last 2 or 3 years, become a little bit less dominant. So there's a lot of interesting conversations going on at the Kremlin as to how much of a priority Venezuela should be, given what could be the international costs of supporting Maduro too openly, given the rising number of countries that are recognizing the interim presidency of Juan Guaido.
Daniel Lansberg-Rodriguez, many thanks for joining us from Chicago.
Thank you for having me, François.